Late in the winter of 1884, the town of Harrow Creek kept two ledgers. One sat in the land agent's office and counted acres and debts. The other hung on a nail inside the white-framed church, and it counted souls. To have your name on the church roll in a Nebraska plains town was no small thing. The roll was the list of neighbors who owed you a day at threshing and a place at the winter suppers. It was your credit at the store and your ground in the burial yard. A name struck from it was a person cut loose on open prairie. On the Friday before that Sabbath, a paper went up on the church door. It said the standing of the widow Mercy Calloway would be brought before the congregation. It did not say the word that everyone was already saying. Mercy read the notice herself, in a gray wind, with snow still crusted in the wheel ruts. She was 40 years old. She had buried her husband Wendell 2 winters back and had held his quarter section alone ever since, 160 acres of sod and hard grass that no one had expected a widow to keep. "You would save yourself a great deal," a deacon's wife told her at the store that morning, "if you would only sell and take a room in town." "I have a house," Mercy said. "I built half of it back myself." The woman looked at her as people look at a horse that will not lead. Then she gathered her parcels and went out. Mercy stood a moment among the barrels of meal and the bolts of cloth, and she understood that the vote was half counted before a single hand had risen. What she did not yet know was whether one soul in that church would stand when it did. Mercy Calloway had not meant to become a scandal. She had only meant to get through the winter, which on the high plains was its own kind of war. Timber was scarce out on the flats, so she burned what the land gave her. She twisted prairie hay into tight, hard knots that held a flame near as long as a stick of cordwood, and she kept a bushel basket of them banked by the stove. When the cold came down hard, she shoveled sod and snow up against the north wall of the soddy until the earth itself held the warmth in. A house dug from the ground stayed warmer than any cabin of green lumber if you tended the roof and kept the melt from running down the walls. She knew these things because she had learned them alone, by getting them wrong once and not twice. She kept her own books, too. Every hide sold, every bushel of corn, every dollar owed and paid, set down in a hand as plain as a man's. That was part of what they could not forgive her. A widow was supposed to need saving. Mercy did not appear to need anything, and a woman who needs nothing is a hard thing for a small town to place. Then, in the worst week of January, the trouble that would become her ruin walked up out of the snow. A blizzard closed the country for 3 days. On the first night, a knock came at her door, and she opened it to a boy half frozen, a cowhand off the Amos Range, named Dell, who had gone out after strays and lost the trail in the white. His horse was gone. His hands were the color of tallow. If she had turned him back into that storm, he would have been dead by morning, and every soul in the county knew it. She did not turn him back. She thawed his hands slow in cool water so the blood would not burst the skin. She fed him broth and kept the stove twisted full of hay. She melted pans of snow for water, for the well rope had frozen through, and she doled out the hay twists careful so the fire would last the whole storm out. For 3 days, while the wind screamed over the roof, she kept a stranger's son alive. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared hard and blue, and Dell walked out toward home on his own 2 feet. That was the whole of it. That was the sin. A man had stayed 3 nights under a widow's roof, and in Harrow Creek that was enough. The story went from mouth to mouth and lost its blizzard on the way. By the time it reached the front pews, it had no snow left in it, only a woman alone and a man who was not her husband, and a door that had stayed shut against the cold. Deacon Silas Thorne carried it furthest. Thorne farmed the section that ran along Mercy's east line, and he had wanted her ground since before Wendell was cold. He had offered once to buy it cheap, calling it a kindness to a widow, and she had told him no with a plainness he never forgave. A woman off the church roll, shamed and friendless, might sell at last. A woman with no neighbors could not hold a claim alone. He came to her gate on the Wednesday before the vote, and he did not get down from his wagon. "I will speak plain, for your own good," Thorne said. "There is a motion coming Sunday. It would grieve me to see your name read out in front of the whole town." "Then do not bring it," Mercy said. "It is not mine to bring or bury. The body decides such things." "The body," she said. "You mean you and 4 men who have wanted my East Line for 2 years." Thorne's mouth tightened. A woman who sold her ground and boarded respectable in town would give the body nothing to decide. No motion, no shame. "You take my meaning." "I take it entirely," she said. "You would have me trade my quarter section for a pew I already own." "I would have you be sensible. A widow cannot stand against a whole congregation." "Then it will be a short vote," Mercy said. "Good day, Deacon." And she turned back to her stock and left him talking to her fence. She did not weep after he left, and she did not run. But she understood the arithmetic behind the shame. Off the roll meant no man would send his sons to help her at threshing. It meant the store would want cash and give no credit, and the county would remember, come the next hard winter, that she was nobody's neighbor. Shame she could carry. It was the arithmetic that could starve her out. A single family could not raise a barn or bring in a whole harvest alone out on that grass, and anyone who had ever leaned on a neighbor knew it in the bone. If you have come this far into Harrow Creek and you want to see how a hard little town decides who belongs to it, take a moment to subscribe so the next story finds you. Then settle back, because Sunday is coming, and not every soul in that church has made up its mind. Word of the motion reached the Amos Range on Thursday, carried by the same wind that carried everything else. Amos was a cattleman of 45, a wide, weathered man who supplied the beef for the church suppers and held paper with half the men who would vote on Sunday. He had built his standing in that valley one handshake at a time, and he knew to the dollar what it was worth and how fast it could go. He found Dell mending a bridle in the tack room and stood in the door until the boy looked up. "Tell me again about the storm," Amos said. "All of it. Leave nothing out." So Dell told it again. The lost horse, the white that swallowed the fence line, the single lit window he had crawled toward on his knees when his legs would no longer carry him. He told about his hands in the cool water, and the broth, and the hay stove roaring, and how she had sat up the whole first night to keep him from sleeping down into death. "She never asked me for a thing," Dell said. "Not thanks, not pay, not a word in her favor. She just kept me breathing till it was safe to stop." "And you would swear to that," Amos said. "Before the whole congregation." "I would swear it on my life," Dell said, "seeing as she is the reason I still have one." Amos said nothing for a while. He thought about the note he held at the bank with Thorne's name beside his own. He thought about the contract to feed the church socials, which any deacon on that board could see canceled. A man could lose a great deal by standing in the wrong pew on the wrong Sunday. He had learned long ago that a valley runs on who will show up for whom. A man keeps his herd alive on his neighbors as much as on his grass, and that goodwill, once spent, does not come cheap again. He put on his hat, then took it off again, turning it slow in his hands in the cold light of the doorway. But the boy was alive, and that was a debt too, and it had his own name written under it. The week pressed on Mercy from every side at once. At the store, the clerk added her total twice and said, careful and quiet, that the owner would want cash now. The neighbor who had promised his boys for her spring plowing sent word that he could not spare them after all. 2 women who had traded eggs with her for years found somewhere else to look when she passed on the road. She fed her stock and mended her fence and split her hay into twists, as if the Sabbath were any other day. If they meant to read her out, she decided, they would do it to her face, in the light, and she would sit in her own seat until they did. She would not give them the mercy of her absence. On Saturday, Amos came down her road. He got down from his horse, which Thorne had not troubled to do, and he stood at her gate with his hat held against his chest. "I know what they are saying," he said, "and I know what is true. My man is alive because of you. I did not do it for a witness," Mercy said. "I would have done as much for a stray dog in that cold. I am not here to offer you charity. I would not insult you with it. Then why come? To say you will not sit alone tomorrow, if you will allow it." She studied him a long moment. She had spent 2 years learning to want nothing from any man. "You will pay for that chair, Amos," she said. "More than you have counted. I have counted it twice." "Why would you spend so much on one chair?" she asked. "Because a man pays for what he owes," he said. "And I owe you a life, whatever the town decides to call it." "Then it is your account," she said. "Not a debt I will carry for you. I never asked you to carry it." "Good," she said. "See that you remember that, whatever happens in there." And that, without a single promise between them, was the whole of the bargain they made. Sunday came clear and cold. The sky scrubbed pale over the white-frame church. The congregation filed in and filled the pews, and there was a low sound under the opening hymn that was not hymn at all. Mercy came in last, in her dark dress and her teal shawl, and walked up the aisle to the seat that had been hers and Wendell's for a dozen years. She sat. On either side of her the benches emptied by a foot, as if want were a thing that could catch. The parson read the motion in a flat, unhappy voice. It spoke of conduct unbecoming, of a household that had given the town cause to talk, and had asked the body to remove the name of Mercy Calloway from the roll of the church. Deacon Thorne rose to speak for it. He spoke of standards, and of children who watched their elders, and of a charity that must sometimes wear a stern face. He never once said the word blizzard. By the church's own rule, no name could be struck from the roll without a majority of the whole enrolled body present and voting for it. "All in favor," the parson said. "Raise your hand." Around the room, hands began to go up. A dozen and a half. Mercy kept her eyes forward and her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, and she did not turn to see whose arms were raised against her. Then a bench creaked at the back of the church, and a man stood. Amos came up the side of the room with his hat in both hands, and he did not stop until every face had turned to him. His eyes went along the raised hands until some of them began to waver. "Before you finish counting," he said, "you had best know what you are counting." "This is a matter for the body, Amos," Thorne said. "Sit down. I am a member of the body. I will say my piece, and then you can vote on us both." He turned so the whole church could hear him. "That woman kept a man alive through 3 days of blizzard. My man. Dell would be under a snowbank this morning, and his mother sewing black, if she had turned him out into that storm. She did not. She thawed his hands and fed him and sat up nights with him, and she never once asked to be thanked for it." The room had gone very still. Somewhere near the front, a hand came quietly down. "You have built a sin out of the kindest thing done in this county all winter," Amos said. He looked at the roll hanging on its nail beside the pulpit. "Her seat stays beside mine. From this Sunday on, I will sit where she sits. Then you would set yourself against your own church," Thorne said. Amos was quiet a moment. Then he set his hat back on his head, as a man does when he has settled a thing in himself and will not unsettle it. "If her name comes off that wall," he said, "then read mine out too, then write it right under hers." Cancel my beef for your suppers while you are at it, and call my note at the bank. I will not keep a seat in a church that freezes out the woman who saved my man." Amos stepped out into the aisle, but he did not reach for her. Mercy rose on her own and came to stand beside him. For one long breath, no one else moved. Then, near the middle of the church, a gray-headed rancher got to his feet and reached for his hat. His wife rose with him. Behind them, a young couple stood, and then a whole bench, and then the bench behind that, until half the congregation was on its feet and moving toward the door with Mercy and Amos. The raised hands had all come down. The motion had no body left to carry it. Out in the hard, clean light of the churchyard, the walkout stood and did not quite know what it had done. The parson came to the door with the roll still open in his hand. A motion to strike a name needed the body to carry it, and most of the body was standing in the yard. There were not enough left in the pews to swear to anything at all. Thorne came out after, his face the color of the winter sky. He took in the crowd gathered close around Mercy and understood the arithmetic had turned clean over on him. A man who calls a note and cancels a contract over a woman half the town has just risen for does not gain by it. He earns a name for meanness that outlasts any grudge over a fence line, and he had wanted the fence line quietly. "There will be no vote today," the parson said at last. He looked older than he had an hour before. "The name stays on the roll." He said it as though it cost him something, and perhaps it did. But he said it where every soul on the step could hear him, and that was what carried. A thing spoken plain in front of the whole town had the force of law in Harrow Creek more than any paper filed in the land office. Mercy did not gloat. She thanked the ones who had stood, each of them by name, so that they would remember afterward that they had done it. Then she walked to her wagon, and Amos walked beside her, not touching. A careful foot of cold air kept between them, and let her climb up on her own. The thaw came late that year, as it always does on the high plains, and with it came the test of whether a churchyard's courage would outlast the cold. It did. When Mercy's ground dried enough to break, the neighbors who had stood in that yard came out to her fields with their teams. The man who had taken back his boys sent them after all, and 2 more besides. In the fall, when her corn stood ripe, the same teams came back for the husking, and she fed them at her own table, so the debt of labor ran both ways again, the way it was always meant to. Her sod was turned, and her corn was in by hands that had come within a raised arm of voting her out onto the open prairie alone. That was the lesson the winter left behind, though no one in town ever said it out loud. The roll on the church wall had never been a court of morals. It was a covenant of neighbors, a plain promise to show up for one another when the weather or the world came down hard. Strike a name for a kindness, and you teach every soul in the county that kindness is a dangerous thing to be caught at. Keep it, and you keep the one thing that lets people live at all. Out where the grass runs unbroken to the sky. Amos waited until the planting was in, and her account with the town stood square again. Only then, on an evening when she owed him nothing, and could have sent him back down the road with a word, did he say his piece. "I have got no rescue to offer you," he said. "You never needed one, and we both know it. I would just as soon sit beside you the rest of the way, if you will have me. But you are free to say no, and nothing changes if you do." Mercy looked out over her own turned ground, the section that was hers by her own 2 hands, and she found that she was free to answer however she pleased. That, more than her name on the roll, was what his waiting had left untouched, her own freedom to choose. "Sit down, then," she said. "You have been standing long enough. If your own name were read out before the whole town, would you rather have a man who saved you and made the saving a debt you would carry for good, or one who only stood beside you until the choosing was wholly your own? Sit with that a while, because out on the Nebraska flats it was the whole difference between a shelter and a home.